Alright guys, in this video we're going to be showing you how to run your own Airbnb business without owning any property. So we're going to be talking about what Airbnb is, what it consists of, and then we're also going to be talking about how to even create your own LLC, how to separate business with personal, and then we're going to be talking about the analysis aspect of like AirDNA of how to determine if a unit will be profitable, acquisition, which is kind of like the sales pitch, the sales calls, how to handle those, and then the rest is pretty much automation and setup to make sure that our Airbnb is making us as much money as possible. So I've built multiple cash flowing Airbnbs without buying any real estate. As you can see here, there's a couple of reservations and bookings that I currently have. So you can see like just for 7 days, 8 day period, we got people paying over $5,000 just to stay in our properties for about, a week. So you could imagine how we're doing at a monthly or annual scale. So as you can see here on my Airbnb portfolio, I was able to do 16,000 my first year and then scale to get the majority of my units throughout that year, making 80,000, projected to make over 100K this year. So my portfolio currently consists of 3 short-term rentals, which is Airbnb full-time throughout the whole year. And then we got 2 midterm rentals, which is kind of like travel nurses staying within a 1 to 3 month period, typically a 90-day period. I got 2 more Airbnbs on a management deal, and these are probably the more common ones that you hear on the internet, which is like you essentially just found a landlord that wanted to do Airbnb, but they don't have time for the day-to-day operations, and they were like, "Hey, Ale, would you be able to kind of like run them for me and I'll just give you a percentage of the profit?" So that's exactly what we did. And then I got 3 currently more that are being signed or furnished. So I got 2 that I just signed near the Tufts University, actually here in the Boston area, and I got 1 more that I'm planning to do in Florida out of state. So we definitely got some fun things going for us. Basically, a little background about me on how I got started. I essentially kind of started from very straight after high school. I was always kind of like an entrepreneur. My family had a little pizza shop down in the city near the outskirts of Boston. I was kind of like the eldest son, so I was kind of like responsible of like the day-to-day operations for that. But I knew working there, working 40K a year, I wasn't gonna get rich, right? And the whole thing with me is like I'm very like ambitious. I'm a go-getter. I want to be a provider. I want to be able to take trips. I want my future wife to be able to stay at home with the kids. And I just knew like, how things are going, how society's going, with everything being so expensive, it was going to be almost impossible if not working 60 hours plus. So I ended up getting a side job being a bartender at local restaurants near me. And on top of that, that's when I found out about Airbnb arbitrage and got myself my own mentor that was able to teach me how to do it step by step. So me and 2 buddies of mine were able to kind of get together, start an LLC, and get this whole process going. So I was literally working about 12-hour days on top of the whole side hustle, just grinding, hopefully, just praying that this was all going to work out. So, eventually after a whole year of just kind of grinding, putting my head down and, believing in the process, this is how it's going for me. I'm currently have over 6 units under my portfolio. I've been, for the first time in my life, I've been able to have like a good amount of cash just sitting in my bank account, especially for someone who just barely had like, over $1,000 in their bank account. So I was able to finally have that. I was able to pay for my wedding. I recently got married in 2025. I was able to finally, experience what it felt like to go to like really nice dinners, pay for tabs, going to fine dining. I've never been to fine dining in my life. And honestly, once you do, it's kind of hard to go back to anything kind of like basic. But that being said, just being responsible with the finances as well, with the whole cash flow management, I was able to really like enjoy my 2025, like going out. As you can see, like I was just like really like kind of enjoying a little bit of the money because we know I've never had this type of money and passive income in my life. I was able to move into a really nice home, and I just want to scale this to be a lot bigger so I can take care of my family later down the line. So that's a little bit about me. And now we could kind of really talk about like what Airbnb arbitrage is in general. So a lot of people don't really understand the whole concept of Airbnb arbitrage. So Airbnb arbitrage, it's just, when you rent a property long term and legally list on the Airbnb or midterm platforms to earn monthly cash flow without owning any property. So essentially the basic steps are you rent an apartment, you furnish it, you optimize it, and then you list it on third-party platforms. And these platforms will consist of Airbnb, VRBO, Expedia, Booking.com. And so when you list these under these platforms, people are just willing to pay more at a premium price, and the goal is to make more than what you're renting it the unit out for, or what your expenses are, and you keep the profit, whatever's in between. So a lot of misconceptions is you don't need to buy a property, right? Airbnb arbitrage basically means you don't have to buy the property, you have no mortgage, no down payment, and you have no liability for big ticket repairs. A lot of the times when you are a landlord, you will be held responsible if a water heater breaks, if you need to replace the roof, if you need to replace the flooring, and all these costs, or these big ticket items are pretty like substantial. They're about 2 to 5 thousand or even more sometimes. And so when you rent, you don't have any of that liability, but you're getting all the pros of the cash flow of making $2,000, $3,000 per month. So instead, you just got to leverage other people's properties and leases in order to make this work. You also, of course, need landlord approval of the landlord being okay with the business model, which we'll get into a little bit later on. So quick example of this over here is a real life screenshot of one of my first property, my 1 bedroom that I made in July 2024. So as you can see, for this property, this 1 bedroom, my rent over here in the Boston area was $1,700. After utilities and miscellaneous, my overall expense was $1,950. My gross earning on Airbnb alone was $4,232. So at this point, it's just basic math. It's just seeing like how much I'm left over. So at the end of that month, I was able to make $2,282 after my expenses. So you could imagine if you stack them on a bunch of Airbnbs, how much you can make per month on this. So we're going to be guiding you through what the process kind of looks like from the very start to the very finish on, how to get started to get your very own Airbnb, making you this type of cash flow. So step number one will be create an LLC, form a business using a service like BZ or Inkfile, what it was known. Very easy site. You just gotta be able to, because the reason why you want to create an LLC is to separate personal with business liability, especially when it comes for tax purposes or just kind of like, the liability standpoint. And then after we do have an LLC, we're going to be opening a business checking account. And then this business checking account, where it will be handling all income, all expenses, and just, being able to organize all our funding through this business checking account. Now, the secret sauce out of this whole thing of how I've been able to scale is just utilizing zero APR credit cards to fund our very first Airbnb. So the way it works is that typically with these credit cards, and we'll go into this in just a tad bit after we create the business checking account, is that typically banks will lend you a credit card, will give you a credit card for like hypothetically $10,000. They'll give you $10,000 in a credit card, but you have 12 months of zero APR, basically zero interest for the first 12 months. So if you max out that credit card within the first month, you only owe $10,000 for 12 months. Typically with a standard credit card, they charge interest, especially high interest. So every month it'll accumulate to the point where you maybe even owe double, after a whole year, or long periods of time. So this is like kind of like the secret sauce that we use in order to kind of like fund our first few Airbnbs and being able to scale and repeat the process. So after that, we're going to be finding high potential, high earning units using AirDNA.com. We're going to see and learn how to analyze occupancy, ADR, which is average daily rate, demand, and really understand the seasons depending on location. After that, we're going to be locking in with the right lease, only because we need to make sure that the lease is protecting us from a liability standpoint, and we need to also just make sure that it is correctly formed with the type of business model that we want to do. After that, we're going to be furnishing the property, which will just be, making sure it looks nice compared to other Airbnbs in the area, so we can optimize the nightly rates. And then we're just going to be setting up the listing, how we're able to set up the listing using these type of like third-party sites like Turno, Hospitable, Price Labs. We'll go into that in just a tad bit. So when you're able to do this correctly, right, there's a system to it. So if you're able to do this correctly, because a lot of people have the misconception too of just like, hey, listen, I'm going to start this, and you can't, like basically over here we'll explain kind of like the don'ts, right? So it's not just about a landlord giving you a yes, like, hey, like, oh, I have this auntie, I have this grandma that has like an extra apartment available down here in this area of like the city. It's really determining, also making sure like you're putting your money in a good location that's going to be making you money back. It's not just getting your first yes, not just because a family member has it available, because it's really all about location, it's really all about demand, and just making sure the numbers add up. So when you're able to do this correctly, this is how your calendar should be looking. If you're at a high demand area, especially during the hot season, you should be able to get booked out for the majority of the months. So when you have bookings back to back to back to back to back, and you have a successful Airbnb, you're constantly making 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, depending on the unit, right? And this is just a little screenshot of one of my earnings for one of my Airbnbs. I was able to optimize $16,000 off just one Airbnb, just because I was able to do it at a very good location near university, and it was big enough in order to take larger groups. And we'll get into that just a tad bit as well. So this is basically a brief overview of what the whole Airbnb arbitrage process looks like. So we're going to get started with the very first step, which is creating your LLC. So you don't have to create an LLC, but I always highly recommend it, only because one, it can affect on how much you get accepted on your business credit card, and then two, you always want to be able to separate business with personal, especially when it comes to taxes, because the IRS does not play. So what you could do is you could always register where you live at, but sometimes depending on the state, they could vary depending on the state fee. For example, I live in Massachusetts, so Massachusetts state fee is $550. Another example of this is Florida registration fee is $125. So it is a good amount of difference. You know, we're talking about almost like a $400 difference. So a lot of people might not have the $500 or $600 to kind of get started with the registration fee. So what you could do as a substitute is that what you're able to do nowadays is that use sites like Beezy, which is also known as InkFile, where you're able to buy a virtual address because you don't own property or you don't live in these other states. So theoretically, you could buy a virtual address in Florida, even though you might live in Massachusetts. And because you have this virtual address, you're able to register it in that other state. So the only thing with this is that they might charge you like a monthly fee of like $20 or something like that. But it's a good way to get started without paying, money that you don't have at the current moment until you do your Airbnb that's making you money. So theoretically, you could, for example, if you live in Massachusetts, you could open Florida LLC under for $125, and then you get your Airbnb set up the next month, and then that money that you're making from that Airbnb, you're essentially kind of like being able to afford for that $20 a month fee that you would do with the virtual address. Hopefully I explained that pretty well. But you essentially, when you want to create an LLC, you also want to be very professional. You want to avoid kind of slaying any hype words or numbers when creating your legal business name. Essentially, it's just going to give you the most important thing, which is your EIN number. And your EIN number is essentially kind of like your social security, but for your LLC, and you're going to need this as well to open your business checking account. So what happens after you file your LLC? Well, the process time in most states takes about a few days. Sometimes you could pay extra for it to process a little faster, like 1 or 2 days. But for the most part, you don't need to. It takes about a week or two to receive all the approvals and confirmations and the LLC formation documents. One of the most important things you'll need from the LLC once it's formed is article of formation or organization, which is basically just, paperwork showing like this LLC is legit, here's who in it and when it was created. Also, you'll get like a letter of the state's approval, basically confirming that the state approved of your LLC and it's live and running. And so once you do have that, essentially your next step would be your EIN. It's very simple. You go to the state's website, you apply for an EIN number for free, and then you should automatically get it. If your LLC is already registered and approved, you should get it within seconds. It's very instant. So you need an EIN to open a business bank account and apply for these business credit cards. And then you also need this to file taxes. That's like kind of like the government knowing like kind of like your social security at a certain extent. And then to open a business checking account, right? A lot of people think it's a little complicated, but that's just not the case at all. For this, you're just going to need your business legal name, your EIN, which is your employee identification number, your business address, your basic contact information, social security, and driver's license to prove you are who you are. And so once you do that and you open the business checking account, you'll be able to apply for these 0% APR credit cards. Typically, we want to find a credit card that's 0 APR between 12 to 15 months. The longer, the better. And the whole goal of this, right, is to like use these credit credit cards to fund our project, to furnish our unit, pay upfront costs, deposits, and there are ways to go about it. A lot of people think you need cash to pay first month of security, but there's a lot of sites nowadays like TurboTenant where you're able to use credit cards in order to pay these upfront costs. And the goal is to pay it off before the interest even starts, right? So once we have these credit cards, we are going to be now just kind of looking for, and we know what kind of the budget we're working with depending on what the credit card gives. We're going to be able to kind of do the analysis part of finding units that would do very well on Airbnb. So a very popular site that we'll be using is AirDNA. And AirDNA is a short-term rental analytic platform that shows you real data on Airbnb and VRBO markets before you invest. So a quick example of this is like when you go on AirDNA, you'll search up the address of whatever unit you're looking for. And a quick example of this is a real life example of this unit I was looking at the other day. So this is 185 Shores Boulevard, St. Augustine, Florida. So this 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom unit is projected to make $72K. And that's including with the cleaning fees. It'll give you the occupancy rate and the average daily rate. And this is very, very important when considering what units will do good amount of profit. And so the key things to look at here is these 3 things. These are the most important things you'll be looking at. Now with AirDNA, sometimes it won't know if you're talking about the whole home or if you're looking at a specific unit in the property, because sometimes that might be a complex. So you really have to make sure that it's the correct amount of bedrooms, correct amount of bathrooms, and typically the guest count is how many people you could fit in the unit. So typically the rule of thumb is 2 people per room. So if it's 4, then you could fit 8. Now some cases you could try to fit more, because the more people you could fit, the more money you can make. But another good thing about AirDNA is that if you actually pay for the upgraded version, you're able to also compare with other nearby listings. And it should be able to let you know on the other listings that have, like, other amenities, how much they're expected to make per month on a month-to-month analysis. And so that's definitely something to consider when looking at AirDNA. So with the same example that we just saw before, real quick, we'll go one by one and why it's so important to consider these numbers. So occupancy rate, this tells if people are actually booking in the market, right? So if you're looking at anything from 55 to 65, it's decent. Anything from 65 to 75% is strong. And you gotta remember, this is taking into consideration the whole year, because some months will be more busier than other months. For example, here in the Boston area, summertime is the most busiest time of the year for Airbnb. But during the winter time, that's when business just goes down tremendously. We're looking at occupancy during the winter time, maybe like 50%. But during the summertime, it'll skyrocket to 80, 85, 90%. So it got to average it out, right? So, high revenue with low occupancy usually means seasonal spikes, but non-stable cash flow. But you just got to look at it from an annual perspective as well. So another key term will be the average daily rate, which is ADR. And this is typically how much you could charge per night. So the higher ADR, the better, because that's how much you can make overall more. And so with the high ADR and a high occupancy, you're looking at a very high projected revenue for how much you can make per year. Now, some expenses to consider, right, when looking at these numbers is how much your rent is, how much your cleaning would be, your supplies, utilities, only because, like I said, sometimes even though on AirDNA the numbers might look, attractive, it might not mean that you'll be making a decent amount of revenue or profit after expenses. And I see this a lot of times, especially in high dense populated areas like in Miami or Boston. It just really depends on what location you're looking at, right? So over here too, we're always going to look at also real life examples of Airbnbs or of the location that we're looking for. So if we were looking at St. Augustine, we're going to look at actually in the Airbnb platform and look at other Airbnbs in the area for St. Augustine. And so one thing we're going to consider is too, like, what are the high performing listings doing? What do they have? What do they don't have? Any listings that are the calendar is empty, like, why is it empty? Why aren't they not doing very well? Sometimes sometimes depending on location, most like Airbnb listings might have a certain amenity. Like over here in the Boston area, you don't see absolutely no listings with a hot tub. But if you go more up north to the New Hampshire or Maine side, almost every listing will have a hot tub or some amenity like that. I think the same might be for Florida. When I was searching up the other day, where the majority had pools, they had big backyard space. So if you're trying to invest in these areas, you better make sure that the listing you're trying to get has these type of amenities to compete or even more. You know what I'm saying? So that's something to really consider. At the end of the day, too, once you kind of do your due diligence and look at real life listings, you just kind of want to see if the math makes sense. So in this case, we got the rent for this property for the 185 Shore Boulevard. We're looking at 2100 is the rent, so we're going to times it by 12 because we got to look at it from an annual perspective. So 2100 times 12 is 25,200. Estimated expenses for this is about $10,000 over there in the Florida area, so the total expense would be 35,200. Estimated revenue is 72,400. So we're going to subtract that by the 35,000, which is our expense, and so we are left with 37,200 for profit. So this would be a really, really good profitable unit that we might consider investing to. Now that we know how to properly use AirDNA and we're able to see what units will be profitable, our next step will be acquisition. Now, acquisition is the process of acquiring and renting an apartment to make it into our asset to run it as an Airbnb. So a couple of places that are most common that we'll be looking at and type of platforms that have apartments for rent will be Zillow, HomePants, Apartment.com, and Facebook Marketplace. I like to typically start off with something very simple in the beginning, like, hey, are you the landlord, or hey, do you accept corporate leases? And then once we get some type of engagement, then that's when we'll hit them with the sales script. So for example, I say something like, hi, Brian, I'm an acquisition manager at Keystone Renters LLC, and we work with landlords to lease 12 to 24 month leases units to house our traveling clientele, such as travel nurses, foreign exchange students, or vetted corporate travelers. We handle all of our costs, such as resident security, and we furnish the unit at our expense. We also handle the rent every month despite occupancy and do bi-weekly cleanings to ensure the property is always in excellent condition. Is this something we can discuss? So after going through that, right, a couple of key things I like to say is basically who I am, what company I'm working for. I try to sound a little bit more professional, saying I'm an acquisition manager, or I'm basically one of the owners. But sometimes they don't need to know that. Basically, we let them know like we want to rent out to you for long term, 12 to 24 months. But we will be, furnishing the unit at our expense, and we will be renting out to others. And then we let them know like we're going to pay you rent no matter what, despite occupancy, and we're going to be doing multiple cleanings throughout any type of stage to make sure that the house is well maintained. So after that, right, it's something to really consider when you're doing the sales pitch or talking to landlords is that we got to really fix up kind of like your vocabulary, right? A lot of people just assume, right, we're going to hop on the phone call and just be like, hey, Brian, do you mind if I can rent out your apartment and run an Airbnb business? And 99% of the time, they're going to say no. They're going to say no, and so you really want to fix up some key words and, fix your vocabulary sound as professional as possible. So you're going to want to say things like, hey, I'm running a midterm to short-term rental business, not I'm running an Airbnb business. You also kind of want to stay from saying the word guest or vacation or anything related to that. You just want to sound very professional, say clientele or vetted tenants. Landlords love the word vetted tenants. And then some words down here below is something you can use for references too, something you can incorporate into your language when you are talking with them or for whatever reason they're asking you a couple of questions. So you can always say corporate housing, midterm furnished rentals, travel professional housing, insurance and workforce housing. Just stay away from parties, weekends, vacations, or one-night stays, right? Even though that might be the case. So some common questions I'll get from landlords will be essentially, I wrote them down for you and what I usually say. So essentially, I always have someone to be like, hey, what happens if a tenant, God forbid, they punch a hole in the wall and, who's responsible? So I just let them know, like, we are actually insured. We have $1 million insurance policy. So anything that the guest does on our side, we will actually, take responsibility and take care of. And that's actually really the case with Airbnb. So we always got to bring up the insurance in case there's any damage. But we always gotta let them know as well, like, hey, you are still responsible as a landlord for your landlord duties and your landlord responsibilities. Other couple of things I'll get a lot is like, oh, like what if there's a lot of people coming in and out? You know, what if there's like a party? I always let them know like, hey, we take measures in place, like we install cameras around the property to see who's coming in and out of the property, and then that way we let them know we have specific, guidelines that the guests must follow. If not, we're gonna have to ask them to leave. A lot of things I'll also get is kind of like, oh, what if they're very noisy after a certain time? Well, that's like any tenant. We'll give them a couple of warnings, and then after we'll ask them to leave. We'll actually install a couple of noise detectors so you can buy on Amazon or even in your local kind of like cell or Wi-Fi store, like Xfinity. Sometimes they'll have like an extension to their Wi-Fi, and they'll let you know like, hey, they're being too loud after like a certain time period. And then you got your own references, being like, hey, listen. And funding and recommendations is more tied towards like if you do have like a mentor or someone who's already in the game and you're able to use their portfolio, which will help tremendously. With me and my peers, a lot of people who work with me, sometimes they're going to want bank statements or they're going to want references, real life references of other landlords. And so all my landlords love me, right? So I'll be like, hey, listen, let them know that we work together, and then I'll let my landlord know that we're potentially trying to sign, and then my partner is going to send you the landlord number so he say good things about me, right? Basically to demonstrate that we are a legit business making money. Now, another key thing when doing these sales calls or sales pitches is that we really have to understand the mindset of the landlord, right? So the best type of landlords to work with are investors, and they only care about two things. They care about money, and they care about a clean, maintained property. So if you're able to provide both of these things, right, then your odds of like, them signing with you just goes up by like, 10x. So that's why in sales pitch, I actually bring that up all the time. We'll be like, hey, despite occupancy, you're going to get paid, right? And just keep in mind that we're going to do a lot of cleanings in there. So, believe it or not, after a year, our apartments actually look in way better condition than the tenant that stayed there for a whole year by themselves, right? Sometimes I always like to bring the example of like, driving a new car. When you buy a new car, you're like, you're taking very, very good care of it because you know how much money you took, this and that. But after a couple of months of like, hitting curves, hitting this, hitting that, you don't really care about it, right? So, that's always like a good example to kind of bring up when, talking about like the type of guests, and believe it or not, that our units actually look better than long term. A couple of things to stay away from, right, is HOAs or condos. Usually these type of buildings already have like kind of rules and regulations in place so that we cannot do any short term, maybe mid-term rentals, but most of them will do not short term. Now this really depends on the state as well. I know for a fact that in Florida, they actually like have condos specifically made for short term, which is nuts. But I think Florida might be the only one I've ever heard of, to be honest. But for the most part, a lot of them don't like it. So just stay away from big, management companies, HOAs, condos, brokerage, realtors, Airbnb restricted cities. Now, realtors have kind of like a love and hate relationship, only because, the majority of realtors I have found, they don't like working with us, because we do something very different. So once they hear something different, a lot of people just don't like change, right? They don't like trying something new. So they'll just automatically shut us down. But, occasionally you will find a realtor or a real estate agent that's may be willing to work with us. So, all it takes is one good real estate agent to work with us, and, it could open a bunch of doors for us. And at the end of the day, when you're doing these sales pitches, it's free, you're not losing anything. So you might as well just, shoot your shot. A couple of tips I put here is when looking for any type of housing is, make sure that these apartments have parking. This is very, very important if you're looking into like major cities that have like, parking restricted areas, or that's just very crowded. So parking is always a must or a plus. Washer and dryer, same thing, especially when you're aiming for these longer stays, for these midterm rentals, midterm stays, I mean. People typically want a washer and dryer in their apartments when they're staying for over a week. So, they don't have to go to a public one. Anything amenity wise that, that makes your listing pop more, that the normal Airbnb might not have, like game rooms, bunch of offices, balcony, porches, hot tubs, and pools. Those will also help your Airbnb tremendously to beat the competition. Once we have found a property, the next step will be locking in a deal with a contract and lease. And this is very important, right? So I use Rocket Lawyer for all of my lease agreements. It's a great platform to build all your legal bindings and contracts. So Typically, we want to aim for corporate leases, and the way we do this is we essentially want to make sure that in the lease, right, we want to always have this addendum and provision added, basically stating that the landlord knows what we are doing and they're giving us permission to rent it out to other people. For the majority of leases that I've seen that I've worked with realtors or just the average lease in general, there will always be a part here about subletting and subleasing, and for the majority of parts, just automatically it will not give you permission to sublet or sublease, and all that means is rent it out to other people. And so because the automatic response, the automatic kind of like lease states that we cannot do this, we always got to add a added provision and addendum, so basically stating that we do have permission to do it. Down below here is an example of like a real life lease that I use. An addendum down here will say lessor will allow tenants to utilize property for subletting to specific clients. This includes but not limited to students, business professionals, and nurses. So we also always want to make sure that we have our business entity on the lease. Sometimes they will have someone kind of mainly responsible for the lease, like have like a manager or one of the owners on the lease. But as long as you have your business entity on the lease, then you are good. And the reason we do this too is for our liability purposes, right? If you're able to have your lease, your company name on a lease for whatever reason, they gotta, you got a lawsuit, you got some form of problem, they could only come after your LLC because it's only your LLC on the lease. And then that way, they're not coming at any of your assets if you have any. So once we have a proper lease, a proper contract in, and we're ready to go, the next step would just be furnishing and just making a budget. So the budget, it kind of range. It just depends kind of where you are and the size of the Airbnb. So I would typically say, it could go as low as for the 5,000, maybe even 3,000 if it's like a studio. But it could go all the way up to like probably like 8, 10, 12,000 depending on the styles of the Airbnb and what amenities it has. So I use Box Brownie for all my AI staging and furnishing ideas. Box Brownie is basically an AI tool you'll be able to use where you actually go in, you type in exactly what you're looking for, and then there'll actually be a real life person that takes this assignment and they'll actually go in and furnish it for you. Now, this does cost a little bit of money. I think it's about like $20 a picture, but it is very well worth it. I'll show you an example in just a second. And then for bigger items like couches, dining tables, all that good stuff, like the bigger ones, they could cost, if you buy them at a regular store like at Bob's Discount Furniture, it could cost you a pretty penny, a couple of hundreds, even thousands. What I've noticed on Facebook Marketplace is that Facebook Marketplace has the biggest deals. You'll be able to like find a really, really nice couch for like $100, where in the store it might have costed you like 1,000 or something like that. So never underestimate the power of Facebook Marketplace. I also have a Airbnb checklist that I have as well as like an Amazon checklist that basically it gives you a list of everything you need in the rooms. Now you might not need to use everything, but for the most part, it's the most like generic, general stuff. You need like bed frames, what the type of TVs, how many blankets, if it needs a rug, lamp, all that basic stuff. 'Cause believe it or not, the majority of people have not furnished an apartment within a couple of days. It's within like a long period of time, or they just don't have enough money. They gotta do a little by little. I actually have this checklist. I'll leave it in the link down below. Essentially, we want to keep it the budget wise at $1,000 per bedroom and $1,500 per common area, like a living room. The majority of things could be bought online. You don't have to buy them in person nowadays with Amazon, Walmart, Target. You can buy this all online. But like I said, you definitely want to take into consideration Facebook Marketplace for the bigger items. Now, this is an example of Box Brownie of what I was talking about earlier about AI staging and furnishing. So this is these two pictures that you see here, basically with nothing. That's how it looked. That's the picture, the original picture I took. So I basically went in, I uploaded the picture, I told the person what I kind of wanted, what the vibe I was going for, and this is what they shot out. Now the bedroom was exactly what I wanted. It looked so real. You could even use this picture to kind of post on Airbnb while you actually get the listing set up, and then that way you can start getting bookings. The living room, same thing. I really liked it. I actually did some tweaks right after, but it's a big difference, right? So that will give you a good idea of like how to properly stage and furnish a property. So once we order everything, we got everything going, we're building everything, the next few steps will be setup and automation. Now, set up an automation, right? A lot of people don't know this, but you actually have to kind of like register with the state for this. Especially in Massachusetts, it might be different depending on state or the country you are watching this from. For example, in Massachusetts, we have to set up a Mass Tax Connect account, and then with that Mass Tax Connect account, we will have to order a certificate, a room occupancy certificate, and with that certificate, we're able to input it into Airbnb to, for Airbnb to give us access to go live. Now, this is an example of what the certificate will look like and what the account will look like. So once you create an account, this is kind of what you see on your dashboard. So you're going to want to go to add a room occupancy property. And then there it's going to ask you for the address of the property. What are you going to use it for? You can even say short-term rental. And then once you do, it'll take about 24 hours and it'll give you this certificate. Once you get the certificate, you're going to be looking at the certificate number, which is kind of like the passcode that you'll insert to Airbnb. And once you share that with Airbnb, it'll register it and you should be able to go live. Now, other than that, I always need to emphasize these professional pictures. It's super, super important that you get professional photos done. And the reason I say this is because a lot of people don't understand how important it is, and they try to like kind of skip the step, save the $100 and take it with their iPhones or do it themselves. If you don't have the money to pay someone out of pocket, Airbnb will actually allow you to take these pictures by a professional. They'll send someone out there. They won't charge you. They'll take them. They'll send it to you. And they'll actually charge it, take it, deduct it from your first payout, from your first booking. So that's a neat little thing that Airbnb provides in terms of pictures. And once you do have those pictures ready, you're ready to set up your listing. This is a brief little kind of guide on how to probably set up on the back end, right? So these are kind of some screenshots that I took from my phone on like what you should see for your Airbnb listing. So it's pretty easy. Anything that's related to titles, descriptions, anything that has to do with, like kind of creating, you're going to use ChatGPT to actually help you with the title and description. Very easy. You just got to let it know like, hey, what can I put for my Airbnb description? This is the address, compared to other listings in the area. Very easy, very simple. That's all you gotta do. ChatGPT kind of carries, nowadays with all the AI going on, it's kind of impossible to lose. I would say under availability as well, I would place a 2-night minimum for bookings to prevent parties. I would only accept 3 months in advance, and that's just kind of me personally doing it, only because sometimes when you book too far in advance, you don't price accordingly, and because you don't price accordingly, you miss out on money, essentially. You want to add all the amenities and check-in info, especially under check-in guide. This will make the process of check-in so much more smoother, right? Because you don't want to be talking with too much gas back and forth. Occasionally you will have to, but you want to do it as little as possible. So the more clear instructions you have with check-in instructions, with the Wi-Fi, where everything is, how to enter the property, the better it will be for you. Lastly, you're going to want to connect your smart lock and place house rules for desired check-in and check-out. Once you got that going, just make sure your cancellation policy is set to firm, and you should be good to go. This is how I probably set up my Airbnb listings. Cool thing about Airbnb as well is that they will have automated messaging, and this automated messaging system will basically just be kind of like 4 generic messages that I've made. And the cool thing about this too is that you're able to schedule them. So like it'll ask you when do you want the message to shoot out, and you'll be able to customize it as well with like little small shortcuts and details that you'll be able to customize in these, right? So these are actually the prompts for those. Our first message will be the confirmation, right? Like we're right here, you have the times of each one. So the first one over here will be 5 minutes from booking, right? So after they booked, after 5 minutes, it's going to send this. Anything that is kind of bolded over here, those are kind of like the details that you'll be getting under here. So you're going to click under insert details. It'll give you a bunch to choose from. And this is literally what it says word by word. And then you'll be looking at for in this list over here, insert details. Second prompt will be check-in. Basically 24 hours before check-in, it'll give you all the essential information. Same thing with check-in process, the check-in info over here in right here. You're basically gonna copy and paste over here and check in. That way, because sometimes, believe it or not, they don't even see it on their end. Sometimes they'll just see what it says during that check-in message. You want to include the basic stuff like Wi-Fi, where to park. If there's any specific instructions on how to get into the building, you're going to want to include that into your check-in. Checkout, it's going to be about like 2 hours before checkout, basically giving them a list of rules they have to follow, a couple of guidelines saying like, hey, throw out the trash, turn everything off, leave AC or heating at 69 so the pipe doesn't burst. And then the fourth one will be guest review, because believe it or not, I would say about like only 30% of guests will leave a review, and that's just they just forget about it. It's natural, you know. So we want to send them an automated message just a couple hours after their checkout, and we typically do this to incentivize review, because the more 5 stars review that you guys get, the better it will be for your profile. So we're able to kind of send like an automated message, something like, hey, you know, for example, Brian, we appreciate your stay with us in our home. We left you a 5-star review. We would gladly appreciate it if you could leave us a positive review when you have the time. Thank you. Something so easy like that will, you know, go a long way. So that's how I set up on the back end for my Airbnb accounts. And then once you have that set up, we're going to be using tools for automation. And these are all softwares that I use for different reasons. Hospitable is the first one that we have on the list. Hospitable is a management software that will help Airbnb users for short-term rentals by, you know, being able to manage the messaging, reviews, check-in instructions, all that fun stuff. We also have dynamic pricing software such as Price Labs. Price Labs is one of my favorites because it uses real-time market data, and it'll keep track of like high demand dates. For example, over here in Boston, we have the Boston Marathon in April. May typically graduation, so it'll boost up the prices for that. And it'll typically know what days are very busy, so it'll increase the prices. And it'll also know what days are very low demand, and that's when it'll lower the price to incentivize more bookings. We use Turno for cleanings and cleaners. So Turno is actually a turnover management platform for short-term rental hosts. Basically, we're able to kind of schedule cleanings, assign cleaners, communicate with the cleaners, and actually manage the payment for the cleaners. So we actually just connect this to our Airbnb, and the rest will be done for us. The cleaners, if you can't find a cleaner in the area, that this might be a good place to look for to get started. So I use Turno for all my cleanings. I'll also use Slodge for all of my smart locks. I think it's one of the best smart locks out there. It'll give you easy access to manage all the guest unique codes and notifications, so you're able to actually know who comes in and out, if you need to change the code, and all that related to the guests coming in and out. Ring cameras are probably my preferred ones as well for cameras, just because they last pretty long. I would say they last on average, depending which one you get, like 2 to 3 months. That you gotta charge them, unless they're battery operated. You just change the batteries, or if they're solar powered, if they're outside. But basically, it's very easy to install. The app will actually let you see in real time and record any movement that there is, so you're able to see who's coming in and out of the property. And that's it, guys. This is how I set up my Airbnbs. These are the softwares that I use to really automate the business, to make it as passive as possible. Now, at this point, guys, in the video, I'd like to congratulate you for staying this long, because it just really shows that you guys are about it. You guys are ambitious. You guys want the side hustle. You want to be your own boss. You guys might be sick of working a 9 to 5 or working these long hours or having to work for minimum wage. You guys want this passive income where you're able to make money no matter where you are. And these are actually some real life examples of people I've actually helped within the last few months to get their very first Airbnbs. You'll actually be able to see their testimonials and their progress on my Instagram if you guys want to give that a follow at Alejandro123P. And these are a couple of the Airbnbs that these people down here have actually created. I've been there since the very beginning with them, you know, from setting up their LLC to creating their names, all the way to like the acquisition process of like using my portfolio at its fullest extent, saying, hey Alejandro, do you mind sending me your references? Do you mind hopping on the phone with me to close this deal for this type of person? So I've been there through it all. At this point of the video, if you could leave a comment down below. I'll also leave my link down below if anyone was interested in one-on-one coaching to get your first Airbnb live up and running. And I appreciate every single one of you guys. Thank you, and God bless.